for the Australian people.
Strong words from China's president on the 100th anniversary of the ruling Communist Party.
Even though the court did overturn the conviction, it was on technical grounds.
We love you, Mr. Cosby!
And a mixed reaction in the United States after comedian Bill Cosby walks free from prison. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Kirsten Aiken. There are encouraging signs from the states and territories today, with several reporting no new cases of COVID-19. It is welcome news for millions of people in lockdown. Let's take you through the numbers. New South Wales has recorded 24 new locally acquired infections in the 24 hours to 8 p.m. last night. Around half were in isolation for all or half of their infectious period. Queensland has recorded 2 new community cases on the second day of lockdown, with a record number of tests done in the past 24 hours. The Northern Territory has recorded 1 new case in the past day. The man was a close contact of the initial Tanami mine case. Authorities believe he has been in quarantine at Howard Springs throughout his infectious period. There's good news elsewhere today, with no new cases in Western Australia, Victoria or South Australia. Let's go now to our reporters across the country. We have Amy Greenbank in Sydney, Talissa Saganto in Brisbane and Mitchell Abram in Alice Springs. Good afternoon to all of you. But first, Amy, where New South Wales has recorded 24 new locally acquired cases to 8 o'clock last night. Which cases are causing the greatest concern?
Yeah, Kirsten, the case that's causing the greatest concern is that of 2 people that have tested positive to the virus that were close contacts with an infected student nurse. Now, one was another student nurse who worked at the same hospitals, Fairfield Hospital and Royal North Shore. She also worked at Ryde Rehabilitation Centre. The other was an aged care worker that worked at Summit Care in Balcombe Hills. Now, it's understood that individual was not vaccinated, although thankfully many of the residents at that facility are. Of the 24 new cases today, the Premier says more than half were in the community while infectious.
Whilst around half of the cases were in isolation for all or part of their infectious period, the fact that half were in the community for at least a few days whilst infectious is a cause of concern, and that's what we'll be looking at in the next few days and beyond as a measure of our success. We can't afford to have people continue to have the virus going about their business.
Amy, where will the new mass vaccination hubs be located?
Well, there'll be one in Macquarie Fields in Sydney southwest, just down the road from West Hoxton, where there was that super spreading event at a birthday party. The other will be located in Wollongong, and although it won't be a mass vaccination hub, there will be another site here in the CBD for city workers. That's going to be located here on the corner of King and Pitt Street. Now, that is to complement the existing mass vaccination centre at Homebush, and another one in the Hunter that's due to open in just a couple of weeks, and health authorities hope that it will almost double the number of vaccines administered each week, up to around 200,000. Also, we have close to 24 regional pharmacies that will be allowed to administer the AstraZeneca vaccine to over 60s in just a matter of weeks.
All right, Amy, let's go to Queensland now, and the state has recorded 2 new locally acquired cases. Our reporter Talissa Saganto joins us from Brisbane. Talissa, what do we know about the new infections?
Good afternoon, Kirsten. Well, one of these cases has been linked to the Portuguese family cluster here in Brisbane. We know that this is a case that was a close contact of one of the already confirmed cases, and we're told that this person had been in quarantine for their entire infectious period. So that's of no concern to health officials, but there is a new unlinked case that at this stage doesn't seem to have a source. We're told it is a 37-year-old woman who worked for Qatar Airlines at the check-in counter at the Brisbane International Airport. Now, our Chief Health Officer, Dr. Jeanette Young, says it's most likely that this woman contracted the infection while she was working, possibly through contact with international flight crew. There is testing underway to try and determine the source of this infection, as well as the exact variant that this woman might be carrying. In the meantime, health officials are working very quickly to try and track down all of the close contacts of this woman to get them tested and isolated. There'll also be some additional exposure sites that will be added to the Queensland Health website. So, of course, as always, people are being encouraged to go online and check that to make sure that they haven't been in any of the locations of any of Queensland's current cases. But thankfully today we're told that this woman's movements were fairly limited during her infectious period, which is dated back now to the Friday of last week, so only a few days there before she tested positive. So hopefully that list isn't too long.
Okay, now, Talissa, is there any indication from health authorities yet on whether the current lockdown will be lifted or extended?
Well, it's a million-dollar question, isn't it, Kirsten? The lockdown is expected to end, or scheduled to end, at 6 p.m. tomorrow, and both the CHO and the Premier today said the case numbers that we saw today and yesterday, they are very encouraging, and they're especially happy about the fact that that highly infectious Delta strain isn't spreading rampant in the community. But Dr. Young did say that even though these case numbers are promising, she can't be confident that more cases won't pop up soon, and that's why this contact tracing is so crucial.
I now have 5 incidents that we're having to manage, with this additional one related to the international airport. So that's a lot. Each incident in of itself, I'm pretty confident about. They've all been very well managed and they're lower risk, but 5 of them simultaneously is a lot. So we'll just have to wait and see how we go.
All of this, the fact that we've had a large number of testing, plus we are not seeing more wide-scale community cases, is very, very encouraging. So I thank Queenslanders, but we're not out of the woods yet.
So health officials here aren't wanting to jump the gun on whether lockdown will be extended or whether it will end tomorrow. They're stressing that we need at least another day or so before they can make that decision definitively. And we're told at this stage that's going to happen tomorrow morning.
Okay, Talissa, we're going to cross now to Mitchell Abram in Alice Springs. Of course, that city is on day 1 of a 3-day lockdown. Mitchell, just tell us, what is the latest where you are?
So the latest out of the Territory today that we heard in the press conference earlier, there is just 1 new case in the Territory today. That man is a close contact of the man at the centre of the Tanami mine outbreak. This new case left the mine on Friday the 25th of June and was transferred to Howard Springs quarantine facility. He originally tested negative but returned a positive result overnight. The good news is there haven't been any more exposure sites listed as a result of that new case today. So promising news for the top end, and obviously here in Central Australia as well. As you mentioned, we've been in lockdown since yesterday. The government yesterday said that was an extremely precautionary measure given the high number of vulnerable people in the community here in Alice Springs. The government effectively said they didn't want to take any chances.
We cannot take any punts when it comes to Alice. The population is too vulnerable, the stakes are too high. I urge everyone in Alice to keep doing what you are doing, because you are doing great. We are very happy with the level of compliance in Alice Springs.
Mitchell, the town's been in lockdown for a full day now. How is everyone coping?
Yeah, look, it's fair to say that the news came as a bit of a shock yesterday. Alice Springs had been told kind of in the days leading up to the lockdown that we'd potentially missed a bullet, so to speak. So the news did come as a bit of a shock yesterday with that case announced then and the lockdown, obviously. So there was a little bit of panic buying at the shops yesterday as everyone rushed to get their last-minute essentials. The bottle shops were very full yesterday as well. But day 1 into the lockdown, we're just outside the lockdown zone here in Alice Springs. Springs. So police are here checking that people can't leave. Obviously, that's one of the rules. Today, it was a much calmer scene than some of the panic scenes that we saw yesterday. The Todd Mall, a very popular spot in Alice Springs, especially this time of year. We're in our peak tourism period. It was much quieter than it would normally be during the morning and the afternoon. A few people out and about getting their exercise in with their masks on. A few people getting coffee from some of the cafes that are open. They're obviously still essential, and they're food providers, so they've been classified as essential. So people looking to support local business, and that's something that the government has been encouraging people to do as well during lockdown. But whenever it lifts as well, the government did say today it's too early to tell when lockdown will be lifted in Darwin and in Alice Springs. But they said if you can get out and support local businesses, that's a great thing to do. It's obviously Territory Day today, no fireworks this year, but they're trying to encourage everyone to show the Territory spirit in different ways.
OK, Mitchell Abram in Alice Springs, Talissa Saganto in Brisbane and Amy Greenbank in Sydney. Thank you to you all. Just some of our reporters reporting live to us throughout the afternoon from some cities in lockdown. Now, the war of words between the Commonwealth and the Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk continues to worsen, with the federal government accusing her of fuelling the anti-vaxxer movement. The Premier has been one of the most vocal critics of the announcement earlier this week that Australians under the age of 40 can get the AstraZeneca vaccine if they provide informed consent. Political reporter Matthew Doran is in our Parliament House Bureau and joins us now. Good afternoon to you, Matthew. How has this brawl deteriorated today?
Well, Kirsten, I think it's fair to say that it's been something of a rollercoaster ride looking at the relationship between the federal government and some states and territories during the course of this pandemic. But the reaction to the Prime Minister's announcement on Monday night seems to show that this is reaching new depths, at least when it comes to the relationship with Queensland. Anastasia Palaszczuk and her state's Chief Health Officer, Jeanette Young, came out swinging yesterday after this announcement that Australians could get the AstraZeneca vaccine if they're under the age of 40 and they've been fully briefed on the risks by their GPs, with Jeanette Young going as far as to say that she did not want to see Queenslanders die as a result of this decision. The Federal Finance Minister took aim at those comments a little earlier today. Here's what he had to say.
Certainly the type of scaremongering we've seen coming from the Queensland Premier and the Queensland Chief Medical Officer don't help confidence. They do help anti-vaxxers, and that's why they ought to take a calmer, more rational approach, listen to the many calm, thoughtful voices of the health profession across Australia, but also, as I say, listen to her Labor Party colleague in Victoria who suggested that we ought to take the time to listen to our doctors when it comes to vaccines, not anybody else.
That's the Finance Minister, Simon Birmingham, speaking in Adelaide a short time ago. While we're looking at the issue of rhetoric, Kirsten, let's take a listen to examine at least some of what Simon Birmingham has had to say on the issue of vaccine supply. We've heard throughout this pandemic, particularly in the last 6 months or so, that the federal government has done everything it can to ensure that Australia has adequate supplies of coronavirus vaccines. The AstraZeneca vaccine is manufactured in Australia, but the other shot that is currently in circulation, the Pfizer vaccine, is entirely imported. And while there are thousands of doses of that vaccine coming in fairly regularly, there is a crunch on supply. This morning, Senator Birmingham said and admitted that the way in which the situation has developed around the world meant that Australia was at the back of the queue when it came to accessing the Pfizer vaccine, prompting this response from the federal opposition.
The claims that we're at the front of the queue on vaccines were not true. We've made the point for a while that from where Australia was positioned, you couldn't even see the front of the queue. And Simon Birmingham has now acknowledged Australia is at the back of the queue on vaccines.
So, Matthew, the federal government is saying it's a personal choice, while some of the states, particularly Queensland, are accusing the Commonwealth of ignoring the health advice. What is that health advice?
Well, this is where we get further into the debate about risk versus benefit and what outweighs the other there. The Australian Advisory Group, the Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, otherwise known as ATAGI, has not changed its health advice here. It still says that the Pfizer vaccine is the preferred shot for Australians under the age of 60. And that's, of course, because, as we've heard so much of over the last few weeks and months, the AstraZeneca vaccine has been linked to a small number of rare blood clotting cases, not not only in Australia but right around the world. And this is where we get into this debate about informed consent. If someone is being informed of those risks by their GP but still elects to roll up their sleeve, then the Prime Minister is saying they can do so. However, it is worth pointing out that Associate Professor Christopher Blythe, who is the co-chair of ATAGI, told the ABC's AM program this morning that as far as he's concerned, the health advice remains the same.
Do not believe at this stage that young people should be receiving AstraZeneca at this stage unless their circumstances press for that. There are some situations where that would be warranted, but they are quite small.
And Matthew, have many Australians under the age of 40 jumped at the chance to get the AstraZeneca vaccine?
Well, we're only 2 days into this new situation for the vaccine rollout, but we've heard that more than 2,600 Australians under the age of 40 have lined up to get the AstraZeneca vaccine, providing that consent after being briefed on the risks by their GP. Lieutenant General John Fruin, who is the head of the Commonwealth's COVID-19 vaccine task force, says that it is proof some people are prepared to make those decisions if given the opportunity.
Important that Australians have now got a choice about whether they make an informed decision about accessing AstraZeneca. Right now we've got limited Pfizer supplies. We're making that available to people over 40. We've got AstraZeneca available, and I think Australians who want to should be able to have a conversation with their GP about whether they access that vaccine now or whether they wait for another vaccine later on.
That's Lieutenant General John Fruin speaking in the Parliamentary Press Gallery earlier today. It will be interesting to see how those numbers continue to develop over the next couple of days. When Melbourne went into lockdown a couple of weeks ago, that was seen as a catalyst for some people who were hesitant about getting a vaccine to line up and get their shot. However, this is a different set of circumstances. In that instance, we were talking about people who were eligible to get the vaccine because they were in the relevant age groups. This is now opening that up to a much broader cohort of Australians. So we'll wait to see whether more younger Australians are going to take this opportunity as well. Kirsten?
Matthew Doran in Canberra, thank you. Australia's longest war has formally ended, with the country's last remaining troops leaving Afghanistan after a 20-year mission. 41 soldiers died during the conflict, and the Taliban is now retaking many districts where coalition forces once served. Defence correspondent Andrew Green has more from Canberra.
There's yet to be a formal announcement from the Australian Government or Defence Department, but military sources tell the ABC that Australia's withdrawal from Afghanistan, the formal departure, was completed in mid-June, so only in the past couple of weeks. Of course, it was signalled by the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who matched the pledge by US President Joe Biden to withdraw forces by a September 11 deadline. At this stage, we have a number of US troops who are still on the ground, but very few as they too look to get out early, well before that September 11 deadline. Now, the US commander in Afghanistan, a four-star general by the name of Scott Austin Miller, says that the situation on the ground is looking grim as the former enemy, the Taliban, starts to make gains across various districts held by Afghan forces.
The security situation is not good right now. That's something that's recognized by the Afghan security forces, and they're making the appropriate adjustments as we move forward.
We do, though, have a brief statement from the Defence Department which acknowledges that Australia had announced on April 15 that forces would be withdrawn. It notes that for operational security reasons it won't be commenting further, but does hint that the Defence Minister will have something to say in coming days.
It's 100 years since China's Communist Party was founded, and celebrations are in full swing in the capital, Beijing. The centrepiece is a mammoth event at Tiananmen Square today. China correspondent Bill Birtles explains.
They're making such a big deal of it, partly because a centenary of, well, let's face it, a centenary of any foreign political party normally wouldn't be of such interest, but this is the most powerful political party on earth. It has an iron grip of China, and it will for many, many decades to come. But also, too, many analysts reckon the reason that Xi Jinping is making such a big deal of it is this is sort of like a celebration for him, and he's really putting his stamp on China's governance. He already has for the past 9 years, but he's basically using this ceremony today to say that he will be the man almost on a par with Chairman Mao for the years ahead. A lot of it was the sort of language you normally hear. The Chinese Communist Party has achieved so much over the past 100 years. One of the biggest things he likes to talk about is eradicating absolute poverty. But have a listen to a little bit we're about to play. The nationalism in China is running so hot at the moment, and the biggest cheer of the morning was when he talked about other countries mistreating China.
We have never bullied, oppressed, or subjugated the people of any other country. And we never will. By the same token, we will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who would attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people.
It's hard to generalise. It's hard to get genuine opinions about the Communist Party in China for all sorts of reasons. But I think most people are supportive. They're celebrating. Those who aren't, those who are more cynical about all this, they're basically suppressed from public discussion. It's ditched communism. It's ditched Marxism, although officially it's committed to both still. It's now very white-collar in its membership base of more than 90 million members. And for this reason, it's very flexible. It isn't really a communist Marxist party at all, but it sure as heck is a sort of Soviet authoritarian-style political structure. That hasn't changed, and that's not going to change.
US entertainer Bill Cosby has left prison a free man after his sexual assault conviction was overturned by Pennsylvania's Supreme Court. The ruling, based on a procedural error, left his accusers reeling. Their lawyer calls the decision devastating, but says it doesn't mean he's innocent. North America correspondent Barbara Miller reports.
Bill Cosby's accusers thought he'd never leave prison, but the octogenarian is home again, no longer a convicted sex offender.
We love you, Mr. Cosby!
A victory sign, but the man once considered America's favourite dad let his lawyers do the talking.
Mr. Cosby, how does it feel to be home?
Well, he is extremely happy to be home.
Pennsylvania's highest court found the trial, which resulted in the entertainer's 2018 conviction, should never have happened. More than 15 years ago, a prosecutor made a deal with Cosby's lawyers not to bring criminal charges. It was a tactic to get him to testify in a civil case where he admitted drugging women he wanted to have sex with. In a majority decision, the court said using that testimony to ultimately convict Bill Cosby amounted to coercive bait and an affront to fundamental fairness.
He had every right to rely on the prosecutor's word. And they pulled the rug out from underneath him because of politics, because of the court of public opinion.
The woman at the centre of the case said the development was disappointing and concerning, as it could discourage other victims from coming forward.
It's a dramatic twist in what was a pivotal case for the Me Too movement, and the court has barred further prosecution. But lawyers for Bill Cosby's accusers say the matter isn't over yet.
I do believe, or do represent, that a civil case can proceed.
I think it's really important that we keep our eye on the ball.
Bill Cosby's lawyers aren't ruling out legal action either, in a case where a technicality triumphed over truth. Barbara Miller, ABC News.
Donald Rumsfeld, one of the principal architects of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, has died at the age of 88. He served as Secretary of Defence under President George W. Bush, and his leading role in promoting the Bush administration's war on terror faced widespread criticism.
Donald Rumsfeld served 4 presidents over 5 decades. Hawkish in outlook and a waspish personality, he was a key architect of America's response to 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan, and most controversially, the invasion of Iraq. A Navy pilot in the 1950s, Rumsfeld later became an Illinois congressman. Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger saw in him a cold ruthlessness and gave him a job in cabinet.
A strong defense posture gives weight to our values and our views in international negotiation.
In 1975, under Gerald Ford, he became the youngest ever defense secretary. Ronald Reagan sent him to the Middle East, where he met Saddam Hussein, the leader he'd one day helped to overthrow.
I'm submitting the name of Donald Rumsfeld to be Secretary of Defense.
Nearly 20 years later, George W. Bush reappointed him Defense Secretary. Within months, America came under attack. Rumsfeld was in his Pentagon office on September the 11th, 2001, when an airliner hit the building. He helped move the injured and then planned a way to strike back. Rumsfeld believed the Iraq war would be over quickly, but there was no plan for building a peace. A fierce insurrection followed that claimed thousands of lives, and the pretext for the invasion, Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, but none were ever found, and Rumsfeld struggled to explain why.
There are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we now know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know we don't know.
In this so-called war on terror, he was prepared to push boundaries, including the treatment of suspected militants. But when these photographs of the brutalization of Iraqi prisoners appeared, there was a backlash.
These events occurred on my watch. I am accountable for them, and I take full responsibility.
The scandal damaged him, and with his Iraq strategy increasingly questioned, he resigned in 2006. Donald Rumsfeld was a neocon, a man who believed American power could be used to spread democracy. He was never short of critics, but until the end, he remained steadfast in his belief that he'd acted in America's best interests.
Donald Trump's company and its finance chief are expected to be charged tomorrow with alleged tax-related crimes. US media is reporting that Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg will turn himself in to authorities. Charges by the Manhattan District Attorney are expected to focus on whether Mr. Weisselberg and other officials received perks without reporting them properly on their tax returns. The former US president is not expected to be implicated personally in the case. In a statement on Monday, Mr. Trump said his company's actions were in no way a crime. The original source code for the World Wide Web has sold for more than $7 million at an online auction. The inventor, Tim Berners-Lee, attached the code to an NFT, a type of smart contract which records ownership of various digital items that relate to his creation of the web in 1989. The sale also included a video animation and digital poster of the code and a letter written by Berners-Lee reflecting on his inspiration.
I wanted something which was both a way of tracking information but also a form of communication. So one of the goals was I could use it to collaborate with people I worked with.
51 bids were placed for the work. The buyer remains anonymous. You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. New South Wales has recorded 24 new locally acquired COVID cases, with about half in isolation for all or part of their infectious periods. While there are 2 new local cases in Queensland, one has been in hotel quarantine for their entire infectious period, and the other is a woman who worked at the Qatar check-in counter at the Brisbane International Airport. One new case was reported in the Northern Territory. South Australia and WA recorded no new community infections. Younger people are trying to decide whether to get the AstraZeneca jab, as there are mixed messages around the safety of the vaccine for those aged under 40. This comes as the PM, Scott Morrison, urged younger people to get AstraZeneca from their GPs, while Atagi continues to preference Pfizer for this age bracket. Queensland's Chief Health Officer added it would be terrible if a teenager died during the pandemic because of the vaccine. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. The celebrations in Beijing have been a show of strength, pomp and propaganda, with President Xi Jinping praising socialism as the country's saviour. The day also marks the 24th anniversary since Hong Kong returned to Chinese rule. And Bill Cosby's sexual assault conviction has been thrown out by a US court more than 3 years after he was found guilty of drugging and molesting a woman at his home. The Philadelphia court overturned Cosby's conviction after determining he was unfairly prosecuted following a deal with the previous Philadelphia district attorney. Mr. Cosby was the first celebrity tried and convicted during the Me Too era. Recapping today's COVID-19 developments, let's take a look around the country. New South Wales has recorded 24 new local cases. Health officials believe around half were in isolation for all or half of their infectious period. The Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, has warned essential workers not to go to work if they're experiencing symptoms. She's urging everyone to strictly follow lockdown rules to minimise community transmission.
New South Wales had 24 cases of local community transmission. Half of those were cases that were exposed in the community. A number of those cases were people who were conducting work in the last few days, some with symptoms, and we can't continue to have that happen. Whilst around half of the cases were in isolation for all or part of their infectious period, the fact that half were in the community for at least a few days whilst infectious is a cause of concern, and that's what we'll be looking at in the next few days and beyond as a measure of our success. We can't afford to have people continue to have the virus going about their business.
Queensland has recorded 2 new community-acquired COVID cases. One infection is linked to the Portuguese Family Centre in Brisbane southwest, with the person already in quarantine. The second new case is a worker at the Qatar Airways check-in counter at Brisbane International Airport. And that person is believed to have been picked it up from checking in international flight crew. The Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, says it's welcome news the virus doesn't appear to be spreading in the community.
The fact that we've had a large number of testing, plus we are not seeing more wide-scale community cases is very, very encouraging. So I thank Queenslanders, but we're not out of the woods yet. We've still got another 24 hours to go to see what happens over the next 24 hours, and we'll update you tomorrow in relation to whether or not we can lift that lockdown. But like I said, it is very, very encouraging news at this stage.
And the Northern Territory has recorded 1 new case of COVID-19 in the past 24 hours. He is a close contact of the case from the Tanami mine in Central Australia, bringing the cluster to 16. Chief Minister Michael Gunner says the man initially tested negative to the virus, but has since returned a positive result overnight.
It's more proof that with the Delta strain, we cannot rely on the first test to give us comfort. But because this man's first result was negative, and because he's been in controlled isolation since the weekend, there is no reason to believe he was infectious during his very limited time in the community. For this reason, there are no new exposure sites at this time. I give this caveat though. We are still conducting interviews and interrogating information. We will also retest the first test. At this stage, we have a high level of confidence that he was not infectious in the community and there is no additional risk to the community.
The federal government has released data on how many Australians in each age group have been vaccinated against coronavirus. ABC analyst Casey Briggs joins me now with more in the studio. Good to see you, Casey. It's been a long time coming. How much clearer an idea do we have about the progress of this rollout?
Yeah, 4.5 odd months into this vaccine rollout, we finally have this document which gives us a breakdown of doses per age group across Australia. So how many people in each age group have been vaccinated, but also how many have dose one and how many have both doses. This has been information that we've been asking for a very long time. Many other countries have been providing it since day one. We've finally started to get a breakdown now. What we can say is we now have 7.92%, so just under 8% of people aged 16 plus fully vaccinated, and about 30% or just shy of that have one dose. That's people 16 plus only, because everyone younger than that isn't eligible for any vaccine at the moment. And it's giving us a bit of a picture. I can also tell you that of people over 70, 69.5% of people have one dose, 15% have both doses. It's going to take longer to get those people fully vaccinated because a lot of them have AstraZeneca, that 12-week gap between doses, but it is kind of starting to give us a picture of just how covered we are among some of the most vulnerable age groups, the age groups that we are locking down half the country at the moment to help protect, the age groups that are, most vulnerable to serious disease, who really need this vaccination the most.
And which age group has had the most double doses?
The most double doses, I think it is the oldest, the people aged over 95, so 38.4% of people fully protected when among people aged over 95. We actually are seeing a bit of a bump in vaccinations in the 40 to 50, the people fully protected in the 40 to 50 range, and that's because they're getting the Pfizer vaccine. A 3-week gap instead of a 12-week gap means you're going to get full protection in those age groups, in those younger age groups, faster, and you presumably see that later in the year as well, when more and more younger people start getting that vaccine.
And so does this data give us any hints on how long it will take before we can say Australians are largely vaccinated?
Yeah, and I think it's become an issue in sharp focus this week with so many lockdowns. It is sort of reinforced that the national strategy at the moment is suppress this virus, get to zero spread as quickly as possible. And in most states, that means, this, especially with the Delta variant, the second you get a whiff of this virus in your state, in the transmitting in the community, you lock down. And that obviously is highly inconvenient for a lot of people. What struck me here is many state governments have floated numbers like we need 80% of people vaccinated before we'll look at really moving away from that paradigm, lockdown as soon as there is, the Delta variant, and open up the international borders as well. Daniel Andrews said today, you wouldn't, once you're at a point where everyone's got the opportunity to get a vaccine, you wouldn't have these lockdowns. But that 80% number, even among people aged over 70, 80, there's no age group where we're at 80%. There's no age group where we're more than about 70% of people with a first dose. So that kind of tells us, 80% is a really high number. We are very well vaccinated. We have good vaccination coverage in Australia, better than many countries. But, when you're trying to vaccinate everyone at once, it's a hard thing to do. And the news about vaccines this week can only have served to make some people more hesitant. I don't think that this has encouraged people to get vaccinated, particularly with one of the vaccines on offer. It's going to be difficult.
Perhaps by releasing this data, this might actually encourage some people to decide to get their vaccination sooner than they may otherwise have done.
Yeah, quite possibly. We can now start to track that progress, and we'll be able to tell, in age groups, how is this progressing, and are there particular cohorts that are more hesitant than others. We'll be able to start seeing that now that hopefully this information gets published every single day. In releasing it, the government has said the pace that that people are being vaccinated at the moment would get you to most, maybe 70% of people having a single dose by the end of the year, if the current pace that we're seeing continues. But the big question is, with most of the nation's Pfizer and Moderna doses not coming till the last quarter of the year, with a lot of confusion about AstraZeneca, are we going to even see the current levels, about 110,000 doses a day, continue right through to October? I don't know.
OK, thanks for talking us through this new data, Casey Briggs. Amid the latest outbreak, there are growing calls from state premiers for a reduction in the number of international arrivals. But there are still thousands of Australians stranded overseas with little chance of returning anytime soon, many of them in India. Shyam Dave has been stranded in India since February last year. He joins me now from Ahmedabad. Good afternoon and thank you for your time today. Firstly, how long have you been trying to come home for? You've been coming for more than a year, I now understand. And have you been able to secure a seat at any time since then?
Well, not really. I had a returning flight on March 2020 last year. It was on 30 March. But before that, there was a lockdown in India and, it keeps on extending. And then after, whenever I try to secure flight, it just gets cancelled. The low fare flights are getting cancelled and they are rescheduling for the higher prices. And I have registered myself with DFET as well since April 2020. But to be honest, no productive help I'm getting. All I'm getting is the flight schedules and everything. But whenever I try to book those flights, within just 30 seconds, everything gets sold out. So it's been more than a year now.
Aside from the higher prices and the fact that fewer flights are flying, are there other obstacles that you can see which are in your path from returning to Australia?
Basically, the flight availability is a major issue because, there is a cap per flight, almost probably 35 to 40 people or 50 people. So, as I said, the prices are almost 4 to 5 times higher. Plus, they are just cancelling the flights without any reason, just to do business with higher prices. So, the next available flight is almost 1 month or 2 months away. So, for example, if I have my flights booked on this 19th July, but it got cancelled. Now I'm trying to rebook my flights, but through Qatar Airways, but there is no answer from the airways, like when the next flight will be available. And also they want me to pay much higher price, which is not, it's not affordable for me. I already paid almost $4,000 to them.
$4,000 for a seat home. I want to tell you something. I want to tell you something that the West Australian Premier has had to say today. Mark McGowan compiled the data on people who've gone through quarantine in that state, Western Australia, more than once. Almost 2,000 people who've flown into WA are in that category. He says more than 1,300 have now been through quarantine twice in WA, and that continues. 82 have been through 4 times. 8 5 times and 2 6 times. Do you think those figures accord with what we've been told about Australia's borders being closed?
So what I think is, they are doing COVID-19 test, RT-PCR test before flying, like 72 hours before the actual flight is. Then once they do on the airport itself, then after arriving in Australia. So at any of these stage, if somebody is positive, they don't allow that person to fly, right?
But with tens of thousands of Australians still stranded overseas, are you surprised to learn that there are a great number of people who have been in and out of the country in that same period?
Yeah, that's correct. If I talk about India, probably still 6,000 to 7,000 people are still stranded and stuck in India. And I don't know what the global figure is all over the world, probably 30,000 still Australians are stuck. So, if I talk about myself, the frustration is at peak because I have lost my job almost 4 to 5 months back. I used to work in Optus. So now my financial condition is very worst. I'm facing extreme financial hardship. I'm living through my, parents, on my parents' income here in India, which is very shameful for me, actually. So the situation all over is really worse here.
And so the premiers of WA and Queensland have today proposed reducing that cap on international travellers further, making it harder for people in your position to return home.
Yes.
What's your reaction to that?
Well, what should I say? I just pray that the situation gets better, not the harder, because as I said, it's more than a year. My bank balance has come to bottom, and I'm trying to get back to Australia. I've been in Australia from last 7 years. I'm permanent resident. I have my job there. I was having my job there. Now I'm paying my rent, my car mortgages regularly. So the reaction, what should I say? I just pray that I get back to Australia as soon as possible so that I can start my life once again, because it has stopped from more than a year now.
Shyam, Dave, we wish you the best with your return journey. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
To the day's finance news now with David Chow. And David, some house price figures came out today. What is the latest?
Well, this is probably not going to be good news for people trying to get into the housing market, Kirsten. So last month, June, property prices on average in Australia went up by almost 2%. Now, when we look at all the capital cities, you can see every market has performed very differently, but they've all gone up. So taking a quick look, Hobart, Sydney and Canberra prices went up the most, up between 2 and 3% last month. Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide up between 1.5% to 2%, still very strong there, while Perth and Darwin slowed down a bit last month, but they still had massive gains when you look back at it for the entire year. So for more on this story, let's bring out Eliza Owen, who's the head of research at Core Logic. Eliza, is there any good news in any of this for people trying to get into the housing market?
Hi, David. I think the good news for first home buyers would probably be more the institutional response to this affordability crisis that we're seeing. We've seen expansions to things like the family home guarantee, the new home guarantee, and the first home loan deposit scheme. And I think the increase of places for those schemes just speaks to some of the challenges that we've seen in the Australian housing market, with values up almost 14% over the year.
So pretty much every economist reckons property prices will shoot up rapidly this year, like an extra 15, 20%, and it doesn't sound like there's anything that can slow it down, or is there?
Look, I think it's probably not too bad a prediction given the rapid increase that we've seen in the year to date. In terms of the headwinds that we're looking at, these are probably going to be things like changes to lending conditions. We've seen some of the major banks forecast increases in the cash rate as early as 2022, which is well before the RBA messaging that we've seen previously around 2024. So any increase to the cost of mortgage debt is going to deter housing demand, which would change the dynamic. And we've also seen some more I think subtle announcements around tightened lending conditions as well, such as APRA contacting major banks, ensuring that they're proactively managing risk in the home lending space. And that's where we've seen, for example, CBA have since increased their serviceability floor rate for home loan assessment. So that's an example of where we might see lending conditions tighten up a little bit, which could see some less demand in the market as well.
So apart from record low interest rates, it looks like prices are rising because of hot demand from buyers and not enough sellers putting up their properties for sale. So why is there such low supply?
That's been a persistent feature of the current housing market upswing. In the 3 months to June, we saw about 130,000 new listings advertised for sale. But during this time, there were 170,000 transactions, which means for every new listing that gets put on the market, there's more than one sale, and that depletes total supply. We think that this is due to lockdowns over 2020, people thinking it's not really a good time to sell during those periods. But then even when restrictions have eased, we've probably seen less mobility around Australia as a result of the COVID restrictions and people in regions in particular kind of staying put, not moving to the cities. So that lack of mobility has kind of kept stock on the market quite tight as well. And we've also just heard anecdotes of a deadlock that people want to list their property and sell, but because they can't find anything to move into, that's preventing them from listing as well. We have seen a little bit of an uptick in new listings as vendors finally respond to strong selling conditions, but clearly it's not been enough to stop these rapid price increases.
Eliza, thanks a lot for your insights.
Thank you.
So that was Eliza Owen, Head of Research at CoreLogic. Now let's take a quick look at the market, and it's down modestly today, though it is taking a breather. After all, it rose about 25% in the past financial year. So today, this afternoon, the market is down about 0.5%. Most sectors in the red, with consumer, discretionary and financial sectors lagging behind. Now, there are some big stocks making big gains today, like software firm NEWSABC, the gold miner Regis Resources and payment app provider Splitit. But they also happen to be some of the worst performing stocks in the last financial year, having lost half their value in that period. So it looks like some investors are buying the dip, thinking maybe the selling was overdone, just maybe. Meanwhile, construction giant Lendlease is down 3%. That's after it issued a profit warning, blaming business interruptions caused by COVID-19, which would have hit its London projects especially hard. Now in Asia Pacific, Shanghai's flat, New Zealand up by 0.25%, Hong Kong and Tokyo seeing some modest falls, down about 0.5%. Overnight on Wall Street, the NASDAQ went down by a tiny fraction, while the S&P 500 closed at a record high, and the Dow Jones rose by 210 points, or 0.6%. Overall, a good year for Wall Street, as all those three indexes rose by at least 12.5% in the last financial year. The price of gold is up to $1,773 an ounce, while oil prices are staying put, relatively steady, as investors wait for a decision from the OPEC cartel, the world's biggest oil-producing nations, on whether they'll maintain or relax supply cuts. And the Australian dollar is a bit weaker at 74.8 US cents. And Kirsten, that's the latest in finance news.
Thanks, David. Time to check in with afternoon briefing host Patricia Carvelis.